September 1944. Fort Hunt, Virginia. The air, heavy with the humid scent of pine and damp earth, was wrong. Annalise felt it on her skin, a sticky blanket entirely unlike the crisp, smoke-tinged air of home. Home was a memory of rubble. This was a place of unnerving green. She sat on a simple wooden bench, her hands resting on her knees, feeling the unfamiliar coarseness of the issued trousers. They were clean, too clean. A woman next to her, Marguerite, shifted, the bench groaning softly. No one spoke. The silence was not the companionable quiet of shared understanding, but the taut, watchful silence of the captured. A screen door creaked open. A man in a uniform she didn't recognize carried a tray. His movements were efficient, unhurried. He placed 2 plates on the table in front of them, the ceramic making a soft clink against the wood. Annalise stared. On the plate sat a stack of 3 golden-brown circles, a pat of yellow butter melting slowly into the top one. Beside them, 2 strips of dark, glistening meat curled at the edges. A small white pitcher steamed gently. The man returned with another pitcher, this one filled with a dark, viscous liquid. He poured it over the circles on his own plate, a demonstration, then set it down between them. He walked away without a word. Annalise watched Marguerite pick up a fork. She cut a small piece from the edge of a circle, dipped it in the dark syrup, and brought it to her lips. Her eyes closed for a fraction of a second. Annalise copied the motion. The fork felt heavy, real. She pierced the soft circle. The texture was yielding, warm. She dragged it through the sweet, sticky pool and added a piece of the salty meat. She lifted it to her mouth. The sweetness flooded her senses first, shocking and absolute. Then the salt and smoke of the bacon, a flavor so rich, so decadent it felt like a violation. It was the taste of a life she had been told did not exist, a life of impossible plenty. A low sound escaped the woman beside her, a whisper so quiet it was nearly lost to the chirping of insects in the trees. Mein Gott, Marguerite breathed, her fork paused midair. Das ist der Himmel. This is heaven. Annalise swallowed the bite, the warmth spreading down her throat into her chest. It did not feel like heaven. It felt like a question, a deeply unsettling, terribly delicious question for which she had no answer. The butter continued to melt. The silence returned, but it had changed. It was no longer just watchful, it was bewildered. This breakfast was not served in a home. It was served in a cage, albeit a gilded one. The women eating were not guests, they were prisoners of war. Specifically, they were German nationals, captured in the final, collapsing stages of the war in Europe, and transporting thousands of miles across an ocean to this leafy, secluded camp in Virginia. A camp known officially by a post office box number, P.O. Box 1142. There were secretaries, radio operators, nurses, and administrative aides, the female auxiliaries, or Helferinnen asterisk, who had served the German military and SS. Annalise had spent the last 2 years of the war transcribing reports in a concrete bunker, the constant vibration of distant explosions a part of her body. Marguerite had managed supply inventories, her mind a precise ledger of dwindling resources. Now their world had shrunk to the perimeter of this fence, their lives dictated by a schedule they did not create. The system that brought them here was vast and impersonal. It began with capture in a chaotic, defeated France, followed by processing in makeshift holding pens where they were deloused, documented, and sorted. From there, ships, cramped, nauseating vessels where the horizon tilted and the future was a grey void. They had been told America was a nation of degenerate capitalists, culturally bankrupt and materially weak. The propaganda had been clear. They expected harshness, deprivation, punishment. Their own government had shown them what to do with enemies of the state. The material stakes were, they assumed, survival itself. They carried the ingrained knowledge of scarcity. Food was a weapon, and to be a prisoner was to be starved. A crust of bread, a bowl of thin soup, that was the currency of power. To arrive in Virginia was to step through a looking glass. The resources were not just adequate, they were abundant. The risks they had braced for brutality, starvation, summary execution failed to materialize. Instead, they were confronted with a new, disorienting set of constraints. The fences were real, the guards were armed, but the beds had clean sheets. The water from the tap was hot. There was soap. There was coffee, real coffee, not the roasted chicory and grain that had passed for it in Germany for years. The shock was a physical sensation. It undermined everything. A body prepared for a blow that never lands remains tense, waiting. Their bodies, taught with the expectation of hardship, were instead being systematically softened with calories and comfort. For women who had learned to measure their existence in grams of bread and minutes between air raid sirens, this new reality was a profound psychological assault. It did not break the body. It targeted the mind. The contrast was a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of each day. It was staged in the most mundane, repeatable details of their lives. First, there was the food. In the last year in Berlin, Anneliese's daily intake had been a slice of dense, dark bread, a watery vegetable soup, and the bitter ersatz coffee. She remembered the gnawing hollowness in her stomach as a permanent feature of her body. Here, breakfast alone was a feast. Eggs, bacon, pancakes, toast with butter and jam, milk, and that endless fragrant coffee. The women learned the American names for these things. They whispered them to each other. Pancakes, syrup. The words felt foreign, luxurious. By their third week, some of the women had gained over 5 kilograms. Second, the labor. Marguerite's work in Germany had been 16 hours a day of logistical triage, juggling non-existent supplies for a phantom army, the pressure of physical weight on her shoulders. Failure meant a transfer to the front or worse. Here their tasks were simple, almost absurd. They were assigned to laundry duty, to kitchen preparation, to cleaning their own barracks. The work was structured but not strenuous. There were defined start and end times. There was no screaming Aufseherin asterisk, no threat of punishment for a moment's rest. It was work as routine, not as a tool of exhaustion. Third, the soundscape. The soundtrack of their former lives was the whine of the air raid siren, the percussive crump of bombs, the shattering of glass. Silence was a brief, terrifying interlude between attacks. At Fort Hunt, the nights were filled with the sound of crickets and frogs, a profound, enveloping quiet that at first made sleep impossible. Anneliese found herself waking in the middle of the night, her heart pounding, listening for a danger that never came. The quiet was more unnerving than the noise had been. It gave them too much time to think. Fourth, the materiality of their confinement. A prison cell in Germany was concrete, steel, and damp straw. It was designed to diminish the human spirit. Their barracks at Fort Hunt were simple wooden structures, but they had windows with glass. They had beds with mattresses and wool blankets. They were issued cotton clothing that wasn't threadbare. Marguerite, ever the quartermaster, ran a hand over the blanket one evening. She could feel the quality of the weave, the density of the wool. It was a soldier's blanket, but a soldier from an army that did not have to count every thread. It was an object that spoke of a nation's deep, seemingly inexhaustible well of material wealth. The contrast was not just in the presence of comfort, but in the absence of deliberate cruelty. The guards were distant, watchful, but not hostile. No one was beaten, no one was mocked. This programmatic lack of malice was the most confusing contrast of all. It felt like a deliberate strategy, a form of psychological warfare for which their own ideology had left them utterly unprepared. The women processed this new world through their own distinct lenses. Anneliese remained the sensory barometer of the group. She noticed the way the morning sun filtered through the pine needles, creating shifting patterns on the barracks floor. She registered the clean, almost medicinal smell of the powdered soap they used for laundry. These small, concrete details were her anchors in a sea of cognitive dissonance. She found herself hoarding sensations, memorizing the taste of peanut butter, another bizarre American invention, as if it were state secret. Her interiority was a catalogue of smells, tastes, and textures that directly contradicted the grey, crumbling world she had left behind. Then there was Ilse, the former radio operator. Ilse was a creature of patterns and codes, and she viewed her surroundings with deep suspicion. She saw the comfort not as kindness, but as a meticulously constructed trap. "They are fattening us up for a reason," she would murmur to the others in the washroom. She tracked the guards' patrol schedules, noting the precise timing of their rounds. She watched the American interrogators, the men in civilian clothes who would call them in for interviews. She observed their calm, almost academic demeanor. One of them, a man with glasses, offered her a cigarette. She refused it. In her mind, every gesture was a variable in an equation she was trying to solve. The food, the clean clothes, the politeness, it was all part of a code. She just hadn't broken it yet. Her analytical mind, trained to decipher encrypted signals, now worked tirelessly to find the hidden meaning behind this disorienting benevolence. Marguerite, the pragmatist, quantified everything. She was the one who calculated their weight gain. She counted the number of eggs served at breakfast each week, estimating the total consumption for their section. She noted the efficiency of the camp's logistics. The food arrived on time. The trash was collected on a regular schedule. The laundry was returned folded. "This place runs better than a division headquarters," she remarked one afternoon, watching a supply truck unload crates of Coca-Cola. Her mind, which had once tracked ammunition and fuel, now tracked the inputs and outputs of her own captivity. She saw the system, the underlying architecture of it all. For her, the camp wasn't heaven or a trap. It was a demonstration of overwhelming industrial and organizational power. It was a message, sent not with bombs, but with bacon and logistics. These women, through their varied internal processes, were collectively bearing witness. Annalise felt the change in her body. Ilse searched for the hidden structure. Marguerite measured the material evidence. They were not just passive recipients of American generosity. They were analysts, each trying to make sense of a phenomenon that defied every assumption they held about their enemy, and therefore about themselves. What the women were observing was not random. It was a highly sophisticated, deliberate system. P.O. Box 1142 was one of a handful of secret military intelligence installations in the United States during the war. Its primary purpose was not to punish, but to extract information. Every detail of the prisoners' lives, from the quality of their food to the quiet of their nights, was a calculated element in a new doctrine of interrogation. The architecture of this system was built on a simple premise: a comfortable, cooperative prisoner is more valuable than a tortured, resistant one. This was a radical departure from the brutal methods employed by the Axis powers and even by some Allied units in the field. The mechanism began with the carefully managed environment. The camp was designed to systematically dismantle a prisoner's psychological defenses by first addressing their physiological needs. A person who is not hungry, not cold, and not in fear for their life has more mental capacity available. The interrogators at Fort Hunt wanted that capacity directed toward memory and conversation, not toward survival. The process followed a stepwise causal chain. First, neutralize the immediate physical threats. This was achieved through the provision of ample food, clean lodging, and medical care. This step removed the baseline of fear and deprivation that most prisoners expected. Marguerite's observation of the camp's efficiency was astute. The logistics were a core part of the strategy. Second, create a state of cognitive dissonance. This was the purpose of the unexpected comforts, the books in the small library, the occasional musical records played over a loudspeaker, the polite, detached behavior of the guards. This dissonance, as Ilse suspected, was a tool. It was designed to break down the rigid, propagandized worldview of the prisoner. When the enemy does not behave as predicted, the prisoner's ideological certainty begins to crack. This creates an opening. Third, conduct interrogations as conversations. The men in civilian clothes were not thugs. They were often academics, lawyers, or businessmen who spoke fluent German. They were trained in psychological techniques, not physical coercion. An interview with one of them might begin with questions about the prisoner's family or their favorite poet. It was a process of building rapport, of creating a space where memory could be accessed without the paralyzing effect of terror. Ilse noticed that the interrogators rarely raised their voices. They would ask the same question in 3 different ways over the course of a week, patiently cross-referencing the answers. The entire system was repeatable and scalable. It was an assembly line for intelligence. The women saw the outward signs of it, the schedules, the regular interviews, the strange sense of order. They were living inside the machine, feeling its effects on their bodies and minds, even if they couldn't see the full schematic. They understood that their own well-being was an input, a raw material being processed for a specific output, information that could shorten the war and shape the peace that would follow. The primary contrast between their past and present lives had been drawn in the currency of food and safety, but a secondary contrast soon emerged, one that operated in the realm of social and intellectual life. It was here that the system's design felt most alien and most effective. The first comparison was in the treatment of their minds. In Nazi Germany, intellectual life had become rigidly controlled. Books were burned, ideas were forbidden, and conversation was guarded. Thought itself was a potential crime. At Fort Hunt, the women discovered a small library in one of the recreational buildings. It was not large, but it contained German novels that had been banned by the Reich. Annalise found a copy of a novel by Thomas Mann. She held the book in her hands, the weight of it a familiar comfort, but the content a form of contraband. She saw other women reading, their faces absorbed, their minds traveling to places far beyond the camp's fences. They were prisoners, yet in this small way, their minds were being deliberately uncaged. The second crisp comparison was in the value of their individual knowledge. As female auxiliaries in a male-dominated military, their expertise had often been dismissed or taken for granted. They were cogs in the machine. Here, the American interrogators treated their knowledge as valuable. A woman who had been a secretary in a regional administrative office would be questioned for hours about filing systems, office layouts, and the personalities of her superiors. Ilse, the radio operator, was asked to explain specific technical aspects of German communications equipment. The interrogators listened intently, taking copious notes. For some of the women, it was the first time an authority figure had treated their professional competence with such focused respect. This inversion, from being ignored to being the center of intellectual attention, was profoundly disorienting. It implicitly validated their skills while simultaneously using those skills against their own former cause. Finally, there was the contrast in social structure. Within the camp, the rigid hierarchies of the German military began to dissolve. A former officer's aide and a low-level clerk were now simply two women sharing a barracks. Their survival and comfort depended not on rank, but on their cooperation with the camp system and with each other. They formed their own small communities, their own networks of support and gossip. They talked late into the night, in the safety of the dark, trying to piece together the puzzle of their new existence. The camp's population included over 3,000 prisoners in total throughout its operation, but the women formed a distinct, smaller cohort within it. Their shared experience created a unique social fabric, one woven from memory, confusion, and the common project of interpretation. This intellectual and social dimension of their captivity was a more subtle, but equally powerful, tool of the system. It wasn't just their bodies that were being fed, their minds were being stimulated, and their sense of self was being subtly re-engineered. The friction was immense. It was the grinding of two tectonic plates, the world as it had been taught to them, and the world as they were now experiencing it. The core assumption, drilled into them by years of relentless propaganda, was that the German way was superior, morally, culturally, and organizationally. They were the master race, and their enemies were subhuman. The Americans, in particular, were portrayed as a mongrel nation, undisciplined, decadent, and weak. Every well-cooked meal, every clean sheet, every polite question from an interrogator was a direct violation of that core belief. The evidence of their senses was at war with the ideology in their heads. Ilse felt this clash most acutely. She would sit in her interviews, a small, bare room with a table and two chairs, and listen to the American man speak. He spoke a precise, academic German. He quoted Goethe. He knew the names of obscure German towns. He was not the brutish, gum-chewing gangster she had been taught to expect. He was a scholar, and his weapon was a calm, relentless curiosity. "It doesn't make sense," she confessed to Marguerite one night. "They are supposed to be our inferiors, but look at this place, look at them, everything works." This was the quiet, devastating power of competence. The Americans weren't just winning the war with bombs and bullets. They were winning it with logistics, with organization, with a seemingly bottomless well of resources that they deployed with terrifying efficiency. The role inversions were constant. The prisoners, who were supposed to be powerless, held valuable information that made them the focus of intense, high-level attention. The captors, who were supposed to be brutal, behaved like patient researchers. During one interview, Marguerite was shown a logistical chart recovered from a German supply depot. Her interrogator confessed he couldn't make sense of it. She, the prisoner, spent an hour explaining the system to him, the captor. For that hour, she was the expert and he was the student. The experience was dizzying. It gave her a momentary flash of power, but it was a power that only served to help the enemy. This systemic inversion of expectations was designed to induce a state of profound uncertainty. If the Americans were not the monsters she had been told they were, then what else was a lie? Was the cause she had served a lie? Was her own identity, built on the foundation of that cause, also a lie? These were not questions they could ask out loud, not even to each other. They were dangerous, internal tremors that threatened to bring the entire structure of their worldview crashing down. The quiet nights at Fort Hunt were the most dangerous time. In the dark, with the sounds of the Virginia woods outside, the mind was free to grapple with these impossible contradictions. The evidence of this systematic approach was not just in the women's memories, it was in the declassified records of the camp itself. The facts, filtered through the women's lived experience, form a scaffold that supports their bewilderment. We can see it in the camp's procurement logs. One quarterly report from 1944 lists requisitions for thousands of pounds of beef, pork, and chicken. It details purchases of flour, sugar, and coffee on an industrial scale. Marguerite's mental accounting was correct. The caloric intake for prisoners was often set at over 3,000 calories per day, on par with that of the American soldiers guarding them. This was not an accident, it was policy. The rations were a line item in an intelligence budget. We can also see it in the architecture of the interrogation schedules. Ilse's feeling of a relentless, patterned system was accurate. Interrogators worked in shifts, and prisoners were scheduled for multiple sessions with different interviewers. The notes from these sessions were compiled into a central file, cross-referenced, and analyzed for inconsistencies or new leads. A prisoner might be asked about the weather on a specific day in Berlin by 3 different men over 2 weeks. It felt like casual conversation, but it was a methodical process of triangulation. The evidence is also present in the personnel files of the interrogators. The man who quoted Goethe to Ilse was likely a professor of German literature from a university like Yale or Harvard, recruited for his deep cultural and linguistic knowledge. The program, known as the Special Interrogation Program, actively sought out these scholar soldiers, believing that understanding an enemy's culture was key to understanding their secrets. Their training manuals emphasized psychological methods, listing physical coercion as a counterproductive last resort. The women's recollections of the camp library are also borne out by the historical record. Librarians on staff curated collections in German, specifically including works that would be familiar and perhaps comforting to the prisoners, as well as those that were banned. The library was a tool, another way to create an environment of intellectual normality that would lower defenses. Annelise's sensory memories are in a way the most powerful evidence of all. The smell of real coffee, the taste of butter, these are ephemeral, yet they point to a concrete logistical chain. For her to taste butter in Virginia, a cow had to be milked, cream had to be churned, the product had to be packaged, refrigerated, and transporting to the camp kitchen. Her simple personal experience was the endpoint of a vast, complex, and well-funded system. It was a system that understood the power of a single, comforting bite of food to begin the process of unraveling a mind. The emotional cost of this systematic disassembly of reality was staggering. It landed not as a single, dramatic blow, but as a slow, corrosive process that seeped into their bodies and settled in their beliefs. The initial relief and bewilderment curdled over time into something more complex and painful. For Annelise, the constant assault of pleasant sensations triggered a profound sense of guilt. Every satisfying meal was a phantom ache for her family. She would eat the bacon and imagine her mother in their bombed-out apartment in Hamburg, trying to make a soup from vegetable peelings. The comfort she experienced felt like a betrayal. The warmth of her blanket felt stolen from her brother, freezing somewhere on the Eastern Front. Her body was being nourished while her family starved. The psychological dissonance created a physical response, a persistent, low-grade nausea, a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with hunger. For Ilse, the initial suspicion gave way to a weary, frustrating clarity. She had been trying to break a code, but she began to realize the message was the code itself. The system's true nature was its open, honest-seeming application of overwhelming resources. This realization did not bring relief, only a sense of profound intellectual defeat. She felt outmaneuvered, her own cleverness turned against her. The Americans hadn't broken her will with force. They had made her a willing participant in her own interrogation by making cooperation the most logical response to an illogical situation. The headaches started then, a sharp, pulsing pain behind her eyes after every interview session. It was the pain of a mind being forced to hold 2 mutually exclusive ideas at once. Marguerite's pragmatic calculations led her to the most terrifying conclusion. Her careful accounting of the camp's resources proved, beyond any doubt, that the entire foundation of the Nazi war effort was a lie. Germany had never stood a chance. The propaganda of Aryan superiority, of a 1,000-year Reich, was a fantasy shattered by the simple, irrefutable fact of unlimited American pancake mix. This knowledge hollowed her out. Her entire adult life, her work, her sacrifices, all had been in service of a delusion. One evening she sat on her bunk, staring at her hands, the hands that had so carefully managed the logistics of a doomed army. They trembled slightly. It was not fear or cold. It was the shaking of a faith that had been utterly and completely broken. In the quiet of the barracks at night, the emotional crescendo reached its peak in hushed, fragmented whispers. A woman crying softly into her pillow. A choked admission, "I don't know what to believe anymore." It was the sound of identities disintegrating. The women had been wrestling with a question: was this kindness or a trick? They had been operating within a binary, good versus evil, humane versus cruel. But as the weeks turned into months, a new understanding began to crystallize, an insight that reinterpreted everything they had experienced. It was a perspective-shifting revelation that emerged from the fog of their confusion. The most effective form of interrogation wasn't coercion, but the systematic dismantling of an enemy's reality through overwhelming material and psychological contrast. This wasn't about being nice. It was about being effective. It was a strategy as cold and calculated as a bombing run. The immediate implication was that their comfort was not a gift. It was a weapon. The pancakes, the clean sheets, the polite questions, they were all instruments designed for a single purpose: to disarm the mind. The Americans had understood a fundamental truth that the women's own government had missed. A mind under siege from cognitive dissonance becomes pliable. It seeks a new, coherent narrative to replace the one that has been shattered, and the interrogators were there to provide it. A second implication followed. If this was a deliberate strategy, then their captors were not simply powerful, they were sophisticated. They were not the brutish caricatures from the propaganda posters. They were psychological engineers. This was, in many ways, a more terrifying thought. A brute can be resisted, but how do you resist a system that pacifies you, that makes you a comfortable, complicit agent in your own defeat? The revelation landed not with a bang, but with a quiet, chilling click of understanding. It was the moment Ilse realized the conversation was a structured data-gathering exercise. It was the moment Marguerite understood the camp's budget was a direct investment in intelligence. It was the moment Annalise tasted the syrup and finally understood it not as an act of grace, but as the opening move in a very complex game. The entire experience was recontextualized. It was no longer a mystery. It was a machine, and they were finally beginning to understand how it worked. The synthesis of this new understanding connected the smallest human-scale moments to the largest system-scale meaning. The cause and effect ladder became starkly clear. The sensation of a full stomach led directly to a decrease in physiological stress. This decrease in stress tended to allow for clearer memory recall. Clearer memory, when prompted by a skilled interrogator, produced higher quality intelligence. Therefore, Annalise's breakfast of pancakes and bacon was a direct, albeit distant, cause of a more accurate Allied understanding of German military capabilities. The human was instrumental to the system. Marguerite's internal calculations about camp resources were not just a personal coping mechanism. They were a mirror of the very logic the camp's designers had used. A system that can afford to give its prisoners high-quality wool blankets is a system with deep, resilient supply chains. The blanket she touched was a symbol of the industrial might that had ultimately decided the war. Her recognition of this fact was, in itself, a form of defeat. The system did not need to boast. Its power was self-evident in the material culture it effortlessly produced. Ilse's search for a hidden code was the key. She had assumed deception, but the system's genius was its surface-level transparency. It operated on a principle of overwhelming evidence. By presenting the women with a reality so profoundly different from their expectations, it forced their own minds to do the work of deconstruction. The interrogators were not implanting new ideas so much as creating the conditions under which the old ones would collapse on their own. This approach, however, may only be effective under specific conditions. It requires a vast disparity in resources between captor and captive. It also tends to work best on individuals whose ideological conditioning is already stressed by the reality of defeat. The women arriving at Fort Hunt were not zealous true believers at the peak of their power. They were the functionaries of a collapsing regime already primed for disillusionment. The motifs of their experience now snapped into focus. The hands holding a fork were not just receiving food, They were engaging with the primary tool of the system. The quiet nights were not just for rest. They were the crucibles where cognitive dissonance was processed into ideological surrender. The numbers Marguerite counted were not just figures. They were the language of the new power that now controlled her life. The image remains: a woman at a plain wooden table, a fork paused halfway to her mouth. On it, a piece of a golden-brown pancake glistening with dark syrup. The sun filters through the Virginia pines. The air is thick with the scent of a world that is not hers. The whisper, "This is heaven," echoes not as a statement of fact, but as the first tremor of a collapsing world. It was a heaven meticulously designed to unmake a belief system, one calorie at a time. The discovery that a system of control can wear the face of care is a durable one. It prompts a question that extends far beyond the fences of a secret camp from a forgotten war. What other systems in our own lives operate on this principle, using comfort and choice as tools of influence? If this question unsettles your own assumptions, that is the point. Notice what changes when the mechanism of power is not a threat, but an offer. The story of the men held at P.O. Box 1142 was different, a tale of scientific secrets and atomic physics extracted under this same strange pressure. To continue exploring how a reality can be rebuilt, one piece of evidence at a time, subscribe for what comes next.